sure, it doesn't actually say on here for some weird reason. Oh, okay, I think it's Michael Whitehouse. So, here we go. Here's the story, Forgotten Valentine. I had managed to keep a healthy skepticism of ghost schools and all things supernatural until I was 28. I found most claims of such things to be dubious at best and harmful at worst. I was very much in the camp of classical sciences as I studied physics at Edinburgh University several years earlier. My friends often wonder about the change they saw in me at that time. What surprised them was that it wasn't a slow, steady change, but rather a complete turnaround overnight, a transformation, if you will. It was February. In fact, it was the week of Valentine's Day. Around this time, I was going through an isolated phase. It's something which often happens in the bleak Scottish winters, where I become increasingly wrapped up in my own loneliness. It was, and still is, a neurotic hangover from my teenage years, one which has plagued me for far too long. 2 weeks earlier, I had found myself wandering through the cobbled streets of Edinburgh to clear my head. Edinburgh is a very old city and has remarkably kept much of its former self. The cobbled streets meander down the steep side of what was once a volcano, breaking off into narrow lanes which occasionally open up into secluded courtyards. These numerous courtyards are often flanked on all sides by tall traced houses huddled together as if whispering of a secret and long forgotten past. The impressiveness of Edinburgh as a city is often lost on those who have lived there long enough to find beauty commonplace. As often happens when gripped by depression, I hadn't been sleeping well. I finished work the previous evening around 5 p.m., and while I managed to get a few hours of sleep, my mind just wouldn't let me relax. By the time I set out, it was still early morning, and the cold January air stung my face. Although Edinburgh is, for want of a better expression, a tourist city, at that time it still seemed relatively deserted. A slight mist had risen out of the water, making it feel all the more cold as I passed through the narrow lanes and down empty pavements. As the shops opened and the first trickle of tourists bled out into the cobble walkways from their hotels, I deliberately headed for a quieter, forgotten network of streets. My wandering mind had indeed taken over, for as I broke through the haze of a daydream, I found myself standing at the gates of an old graveyard. I found it curious that the gates, constructed out of blackened steel rods, were laying unlocked as early in the day as this. It wasn't a large graveyard. It seemed to consist of 2 separate plots, with the older graves at the front, bordering the fence and gate. I found one which was dated 1776, but the epitaph was ineligible. I felt a sadness stirring at the headstone, wondering about who it belonged to. Eventually, I moved off, wandering up the hill toward the newer graves. I found myself drawn to a large old sycamore tree which loomed over several graves. I stared at one of the headstones, reading the words, but not registering them. As my mind was engulfed by yet another daydream, the grave stood out somewhat from windows around it. The headstone was white in color, while those which accompanied it were forged out of a deep black marble. Without thinking, I ran my hand over the smooth stone, feeling the occasional mark of the elements. At the foot of the headstone lay a small vase. It was made of a brownish metal. As I stood there, something rose out of my mind, something which bothered me greatly. At first, I did not know what it was, experiencing it merely as a low, growing sense of discomfort. As this feeling of unease reached a crescendo, I suddenly realized what was wrong. The name on the grave was Lisa Maine. I knew that name well. Everyone in the area did. I had known her when I was growing up, as we went to the same school together. She was someone I watched from afar, full of life and exuberance, while I was shy, reclusive, and reserved. I possessed that intense infatuation and desire for her, which could only a first love can produce. The words on her headstone came into focus, age 15. I was overcome with a tremendous sense of grief and loss, one which took me entirely by surprise. I exited the graveyard as quickly as possible and headed home, ignoring the cluttered Edinburgh streets. I did not look back. Over the following few days or so, I was preoccupied. What was unusual were the immovable thoughts and memories of Lisa Maine, thoughts which now stayed with me wherever I would go. I had been terribly affected by her death, as we were only 15, but that was over a decade ago, and I had not thought of her for many years. It was as if seeing that gravestone had awoken a sense of loss, a sense of pain which I had managed to bury so deep inside of me that I persuaded even myself to forget it. A cacophony of memories now haunted me, beautiful and terrifying. At any one moment, I would be exhilarated by the thought of her smile, her hair, and the very next engulfed by despair at the image of her lying 6 feet under. If I told anyone how I felt, they would have called me emotional or sentimental. For the fact remained, I barely knew Lisa. Watching her for years across a classroom, I imagined myself talking to her, sharing those intoxicating moments which mean so much to a teenager. The first connection with someone you adore. I had, in fact, hardly ever spoken to her until only a few weeks before she died. In one of those embarrassing maneuvers teachers often pull, the pupils were all partnered with someone to take to our social dancing class. I cannot convey the sense of joy and fear I felt when she asked me to walk her home that day. Some people find interactions to be exhausting. Much like myself, always worried about saying the wrong thing. But some can set others at ease with the smallest effort. Lisa was one of those people. As we walked across an elegant Victorian bridge toward her house, the winter sun bathed their surroundings in cool, comforting glow. I couldn't be more content to be in the presence of this happy girl. She was so beautiful, with an incredible smile and golden locks of hair. For weeks, we walked the same route home every day, talking, laughing, and growing even closer. When you are at that age, everything is so potent, most can fall in and out of love in a heartbeat. She stared straight at me in a way she never had. I felt uneasy and exhilarated. There was a moment where she said nothing. Then she hugged me. Her fingers slid through my hair. I will never forget how sweet she smelled, how alive she felt, and how grateful I was to someone for showing me the kindness I had never known. Lisa let go of me, then skipped up to her front door. Just before she disappeared, she turned and smiled at me. Then she was gone. Immediately I knew what I was going to do. For the first time in my life, I was full of purpose and focus, a desire to do just one thing. I ran as fast as I could to the local shops. I was going to buy my first Valentine's card. It had to be perfect. It had to be right. After looking at almost every card, I found one. It was fate. The card was red, with a white circle in the middle. In the circle was a boy and girl walking hand in hand in the distance together. I did not care what it said inside, because I have always had a way with the written word, and I know I could put something down which came from the heart. I rushed home, walked straight past my mother, who barely greeted me, grabbed a pair of scissors from the kitchen, and went upstairs. I knew I would get in an unbelievable amount of trouble, but I didn't care. I cut a slither of material from the red curtains and tied the makeshift ribbon around the box of chocolates. In my mind, it looked like a Valentine's Day gift. I wrote in the card explaining how I felt about Lisa and how much of those walks home had meant to me. I waited for the next day. It came all too slowly. The 14th of February. I will never forget the excitement of getting ready for school. I was so enthused, so focused. I was going to march straight up to Lisa and give her the gift without a care for what the others, some of whom could be very cruel, would think. But she was not there. She was not in the playgrounds. She wasn't in class. I just sat and stared at her empty desk and chair. School finished, and I found myself walking the same route Lisa and I normally would. I stood outside her house, holding the chocolates. I can't describe the feeling I experienced. I went home, dejected. I couldn't so much as eat a bite of the undercooked ham my mother threw down in front of me, so I simply went upstairs and crawled into bed. For the next 2 days, I walked the same route and found myself holding on to those chocolates, not daring to cross the threshold of the little white fence in front of Lisa's house. On the third day, I asked our teachers about Lisa's absence, something which hadn't occurred to me. Mr. Randall, our history teacher, told me that Lisa had come down with a bad fever and was very ill. With this news, I was resolute. I was going to knock on her door, and knock on her door was just what I did. I knocked and knocked, but no one answered. The next day, I did the same, and again, no one answered. It had now been 5 days. It was a Saturday, and once again I went to Lisa's house, and as I approached her house, the sky clouded over. Many suggest when a person knows when something is wrong, they may not be aware of precisely what has happened, but they can almost feel a palpable sense of dread in the air. I was sure that the house seemed as deserted as it had on the previous days I had visited, and while the house was all intents and purposes exactly the same, there was one change. The front door was open, dismissed this as simply by the product of my fascination with the condition of Lisa's garden. I reached the door and grabbed the knocker, chapping 3 times, no answer. I repeated my knocks, more forcefully this time, but still, no one came. The door was only slightly ajar. As such, I couldn't really see much of the interior. All I could tell was the house was dark, and the air escaping through the doorway was musty. Clearing my throat and stammering slightly, I asked, "Hello," several times without answer. The street was empty, and the whole place felt devoid of life. What if Lisa and her father were hurt? I started to play out all the possibilities in my mind, the 2 of them lying somewhere in the house injured. Then I remembered my history teacher had said Lisa was ill. He must have spoken to someone, probably Lisa's father. I hoped she was not so sick that her father had taken her to a hospital. Despite the logic of my thoughts, I could not dismiss the horrible feeling something was indeed wrong. I held on tightly to the card and chocolates as I pushed the door fully open. It moved, silently, but I was sure the noise of it hitting a doorstep on the floor would alert anyone to my presence. I took one last look around me and then crossed the threshold. Beginning with the living room on the ground floor, I moved from room to room, occasionally asking if anyone could hear me. The air was hot, and running my hand across the radiator, I realized the boiler must have been on for some time. As I moved into the kitchen, I heard something. It was an almost rhythmic dull thudding. I couldn't identify what it was, but I knew it was coming from somewhere upstairs. I left the kitchen, which I was glad to do so, as it was filled with the smell of rotting food. The staircase was narrow and ran along the inside of a wall. At the top of stairs was a landing, which curved to the left and led to other rooms. I closed my eyes and thought of Lisa again. I continued on. As I reached the top of the stairs, the thudding noise stopped. There were 3 doors leading to the other bedrooms and one leading to a bathroom, which I could already see was empty. The door to the second room was closed. Again, I was overcome with a sense of intrusion. I was walking around inside someone's house without invitation. In effect, I was a trespasser. I knocked on the door quietly. Waiting for a moment, I realized the room must be empty and turned the brass handle on the door. It opened. As I pushed the door, it creaked and then suddenly stopped. After only a few inches of movement, something was behind the door. I suddenly became aware of the noise I was making as each attempt echoed throughout the house. It was not dissimilar to the thudding I had heard before. I tried one more time, pushing against the obstacle as hard as I could. No luck. I was about to give up when I saw what was blocking my entrance. I will never forget the cold, glassy stare of the face which seemed to be peeking out from behind the bottom of the door. The skin had a pallid gray, a few retreating locks of hair covering an otherwise balding head. Most of its features were obscured by the door, but the only visible eye still stared, clouded and covered in shadow. I didn't scream because I quickly realized not only was this the face of Lisa's father, but he was very much dead. I felt numb, but situation more calmly than many of my age would have, but then I had a strange fascination for such things, reading many accounts of quite horrific death scenes. I stared for a moment, composed myself, and then turned the thoughts of Lisa, where she might be. Was she in the same room? Was she in the attic? All I could hope for was that she was okay. Something then happened, an event which I have to this day repressed. Something which shook me to the core, something I have never told a soul. The face staring up at me through the gloom. The face staring at me through the gloom-filled gap in the doorway moved. At first, it was only slight, and I disregarded it as the effects of shock. Then it moved again. Suddenly the door began to shake violently, as if being punched and kicked by the body lying behind it. The head turned upwards, as the cracking of rigor mortis from the neck struggled against each sharp, vicious movement. I closed my eyes. I was sure it was not real. I let out a sigh of relief and opened my eyes. What I saw I can barely describe now. The face had moved upwards from behind the door to be level with mine. The door shook and rattled under the strain as its venomous attacker tried to claw and batter its way through. Finally, the face pushed and squeezed through the door, revealing its repulsively loathsome features in their entirety. Dead, swollen, gasping, relentlessly for air, all the time staring straight at me through heat-filled eyes. I do not remember much of what took place after that. Perhaps I'm glad. I know I escaped, and I know I ran home confused, crying and babbling like a madman. I also know one more thing. While the memory has been pushed so deep inside I can barely recognize it, I know whatever was in that room slipped through the gap in the doorway, slipped through and grabbed me. How I escaped, I do not know. The truth was more horrifying than I could have imagined. Lisa's father had lost his job a couple weeks earlier, and as bills mounted combined with pressures of looking after his only child, he snapped. When the police entered the house, they found poor sweet Lisa's body in the cellar. Her wrists were tied to a radiator. She had been strangled to death. After killing his daughter, Lisa's father had went upstairs and hanged himself in her room. After a few days of hanging there, the cord he used to choke the life from himself seemed to have snapped. The police found his body slumped behind the bedroom door. The door was open. As time eroded the memory, the explanation of these events altered greatly. I dismissed the entire experience, but one thing still managed to haunt me until I managed to hide it from myself. The police reported that Lisa had been tied up for a couple of days before she was killed. The date of her death was recorded as the 15th of February. She had been in that cellar, tied up, frightened, yet alive, when I had come by to give her Valentine's gift. People talk about hauntings and spirits, but the memory of that contorted face rising up through the doorway was nothing compared to the knowledge that I went to her house that day, that maybe, just maybe, I could have saved her. Yes, I was a child, but I could have done something. I grew up, but I never felt that love again, that feeling of connection with another human being. Seeing Lisa's grave brought it all flooding back to me, those those stolen moments, that thing in the house, her death. The funny thing is that all those memories, both traumatic and precious, the one which would not leave me was the Valentine's gift I never gave. While I still hope the dead thing in Lisa's house was of my own imagination, I still felt the need to rectify this. I had kept the card all those years. In many ways, it was my most cherished and loathsome possession. On the morning of the 14th, I walked through the cobbled streets of Edinburgh toward Lisa's resting place. On the way, I stopped at a little newsagent's and picked up a box of chocolates. On my first visit, I had wandered there by accident, vaguely negotiating each street in a daze. Sentiment is a curious thing, and it encouraged me to keep not only the card, but also the ribbon I made for the chocolates. When I entered the graveyard, I gazed up toward the lonely hill where she lay. I felt hesitant. Not because I did not want to leave the gifts by her graveside, but more because I did not know the extent which the feelings of remorse, sadness, and bitter nostalgia would overcome me again. There I stood. The sun was still low in the sky, and it cast long, contorted shadows. After standing there for what seemed like an age, I pulled out the ribbon, tied it carefully around the box, and placed the chocolates and the card against the cold headstone. I don't know if I said anything. At the time, I probably didn't, as I was still convinced that she wasn't there to hear me. I cried like I hadn't since I was a child. I fell to my knees and buried my head in my hands. I was inconsolable. Those moments of utter sadness, utter despair at the cruelness of life and what it had done to beautiful Lisa, were last I had a true septic, for I knelt there, the wind blew gently through the graveyard. I had read about people having a religious experience, and while I cannot accept others' testimonies, I can say that what I felt at that moment was profound. I had only once ever felt that way before, when Lisa hugged me the last time I saw her. As the sensation washed over me, I realized I had truly been searching for that same feeling again, but never found it until that moment. I stood up, wiped my eyes, and touched the gravestone, as if to say goodbye. I walked to the graveyard entrance with a smile that stretched ear to ear. When I reached the gate, I glanced one more time at the hill, which for me was no longer a sight of loneliness, but one of love and friendship. The second and last time I say I ever seen a ghost was at that moment, for standing up on the hill beside Lisa's grave was the blurry image of a young girl in a pink dress. I did not run to the grave because I knew I did not have to. She waved slowly at me and then disappeared. I walked home. I felt full, joyful, and exuberant. Friends wonder what happened to me around that time. The truth is, I found something I did not know was missing. Some reading this may think I found my faith, but it was not that at all. What I found that day was companionship and acceptance from the only person I had ever truly loved. I knew that from that day onwards, the world was far more mysterious and a wonderful place than I could have possibly imagined. I knew I would never fear being alone, stretch of road. I smile, knowing that if I listen carefully, I can hear the footsteps of Lisa, the girl I loved so dearly when I was a child, walking with me wherever I go. That was a strange and kind of depressing story. Sorry about that, guys. I did not pre-read it before reading it to you. I actually never pre-read. I just